So a lot of us have sayings or mantras that we use to help us get through different situations. One of my favorite singer-songwriters died a few weeks ago, and his song, The Cape, has one of my mantras inside of it. And the line is, "He's one of those who knows that life is just a leap of faith. So spread your arms and hold your breath and always trust your cape." Well, maybe you have a different mantra that brings calm and serenity or brings some perspective into your life. And we know that the 12-step program is full of them. We have one day at a time, let go and let God, just to name a couple. Well, mantras can be pretty good reminders up until something happens that makes that mantra feel impossible to live by, or even more impossible to believe. I really do think that a lot of life we need this reminder to relax, practice our mantra, and to look at things that they are what they are in that moment. Too much of our energy, time, worry, and anxiety is directed towards things that at the end of the day either do not matter or that we cannot change. This is ever so true of what I at least experience in my life, that I am not able to control those things that oftentimes I would like to. There are always things that require tending, and it seems like an ever-present challenge to figure out what needs attention and what doesn't. Our priorities sometimes can feel complicated. Dreams are distant, and in the midst of graduations, confirmations, changes, work, family, planning summer vacations, sifting through what demands are at stake, who needs us and what needs to be done, those things alone can feel like they're a full-time job, plus some. Life is an ever-constant negotiation of needs and priorities, and at one point, how many of us just get weary and say, if I have to deal with one more thing, I just can't take anymore. Well, we know very well in this room that we do get weary and we do get worn down, and in that sometimes we look for ways to escape. And for some, this escape has been turning towards drugs and alcohol to find relief. For the most part, the reasons for these sayings, like keep calm and whatever you want to add to the end, become so popular is because they remind us of the truth of life. They remind us of the things that are most important until that one thing shows up, like addiction. When something like addiction intercepts and intercedes into our truth and upsets us at our very core, when this happens, some sort of recalibration becomes necessary. Restoration is necessary. What if in these moments, if we are willing to build and rely on our relationship with the God of our understanding, we can discover that God has a different plan, a different idea, a different way of being and believing than where addiction has taken us and left us. It does not have to be how it has always been. You can't get away from the fact that we are in full swing of campaign season. And while we see from polls and news stories that the majority of the people don't believe or trust what's being said in general, we still see those sound bites that show the people hanging on every word. They cheer wildly at every promise the candidate gives. And what seems to be present in the energy of those crowds and in those moments is two nearly constant companions, fear and hope. Every candidate knows exactly how to speak to the fears of the crowd, and everyone will promise that that vote for them will bring back that hope that they're looking for. The ones who seem to do this best leave crowds cheering and with a sense that finally someone is on my side. And when the events are over and the elections are done and the reporters have moved on to other stories, all those people who are looking for hope, they are still there and they are still looking for hope. Because we are all looking for hope, whether we admit it or not. For some, it's more acute. And that is certainly true for the woman who's in our reading this morning. She was a widow who had lost her only son. And for a woman during this time, this left her very vulnerable to be homeless and starving and relying on others to help her. She had, in a very real way, just lost her last hope. In our reading, the widow's son is brought back to life. Now, it doesn't tell us what the young man's mother did. I imagine that it was so overwhelming that she didn't even know how to process it. But we do get a glimpse of how the crowd reacted. Fear seized them, and then they glorified God. Well, it's easy to want to focus on the excitement and the glory part of the story, but the fear part is very real for us, because it is fear that can cause havoc in our lives. The Greek word used here for fear is phobos. It is the same root of the word for phobia. And we've come to think of phobia as a way to describe our most irrational fears. Like, I have a phobia of snakes. They will absolutely paralyze me when I see them. And I've pretty much told people if one ever jumps out of a tree at me, I'm moving back to South Dakota where we don't have trees. That is how bad my phobia is. My guess is that most of the people in our reading experienced fear, and it turned into downright phobia. Fear is not an uncommon response in the face of resurrection or restoration or transformation. And that's especially true when we can't explain it or we don't understand it. And isn't this exactly why addiction has so much stigma? Because there's fear around it. It's fear that has turned into a phobia because we are afraid of what is out of our control, of what we can't make sense of. And sometimes we are so scared of what new life may look like, whether it's in ourselves or others, that we try to squash it. And sometimes that occurs violently, but most of the time it's subtle. And in that, it can feel a lot more insidious. But recovery gives us a chance to have a framework for life that brings in new life. It brings in a new way of living. We live out our faith in recovery with the knowledge that resurrection of our lives and having a new life is possible. And there is a fellowship of people who have come before us. There are stories in the big book and the basic text that remind us that new life is possible. And we have suggestions on how we can get it ourselves. So why don't we believe it when we see it? And why do we look toward people who are getting sober with so much fear? Or look at families who are getting healthy with fear? And why do we miss those countless ways every day that God gives us signs that there is new life all around us? Well, I think the reason is this. I think fear is far easier to grab onto sometimes than hope. Fear is an easy emotional state. It is one of our most basic human default modes. Fight or flight. It's reactive. And somewhere deep in the most reptilian part of our brain, we can tap into fear in a millisecond. And that's not a bad thing when you are genuinely in a dangerous situation, but fear can be a dangerous thing for our well-being when it becomes our default mode. It is what can keep people repeating the same unhealthy patterns over and over again while they are self-destructing, because it's easier to tap into that fear than to grab on and live into hope. By contrast, hope is more complex. It's not an emotion so much as a way of viewing the world. It requires us to be creative. It demands more from us. It demands better of us. A good leader deals in hope. But as we have seen throughout many political campaigns, a successful politician too often deals in fear. And that's no wonder, because hope sometimes takes time to cultivate, and fear takes only seconds. Fear is so destructive and so deceitful that sometimes it even wears the clothes of hope. It wears a disguise that tricks you into thinking that it actually is hope. And when we start to believe that, we act on our irrational fears, and we think that we have found hope or a sense of control. And that is when fear is most toxic. We have to learn to tell our stories, to share who we are to a fearful world that could use some real hope. The 12-step program knows the power in someone sharing their story so that others can relate and find hope. Hope comes in hearing that you are not alone in this and that we are with you. We aren't here to fix it, but we are here to take the journey with you. A lot of early sobriety means hearing the resurrection stories of others, those stories of what worked and what didn't, and how people found a new way of living. Alcoholics and addicts help one another by sharing their experience, strength, and hope with one another. This is done by literally talking about how their lives have been changed. And in hearing those stories, there are moments of feeling gratitude for what has not happened in your life, and moments of finding similarities and being grateful for what has happened in your life.